Hi everybody, I'm P.J. Johnson and I'm proud to bring to the light of day the following 6 volumes of video interviews with yesterday's motorcycle stars. You know, the motorcycle competitors of today are racing upon the foundations built by pioneers whose time has come and gone. I've been a fan of these men and women many years, and the talk I hear reflected a need to capture in some lasting way the flavor of that time gone by. What better way to do that than to let them tell us in their own way? And hey, I'd get to meet them all. That'd be euphoric. During a talk with Dick Clamforth back in '93, he agreed to help get this project started using the Over the Hill Gang meeting of that year as a springboard. Since that time, there have been over 130 individuals interviewed with nearly 100 hours of footage shot. All this edited down to some 20 hours of interviews. 2 extra long play Over the Hill Gang volumes totaling 8 hours, and the 6 volumes of what I am calling Yesterday's Motorcycle Stars, volumes 1 through 6, totaling 12 hours. Now, I wish to say right at the beginning of this that I consider myself to be the luckiest guy around, because after all is done, I feel I can consider these people in some way all friends of mine. So without further delay, I'm happy to present Yesterday's Motorcycle Stars.
Yeah, my name's John Cameron. I've been riding motorcycles since 1928. Oh yeah, during the 30s I raced the 30s, yeah. TT races and hill climbs. I was too big to ride miles or half miles, you know. That was when they was only running 45 inches. Well, you give too much weight away, you know.
Yeah.
They figure 1 horsepower to every 7 pounds. That's bad.
Yeah.
My first impression, we went to the beach about 1923, something like that, in Oregon. Some motorcycle riders come up, and one of them had a side stand. He reached down and kicked the door and leaned the door on its side, and I thought that was the greatest invention of all times, because everybody else is pulling back on the river stand. So that was my first impression, really.
And tell me about your first motorcycle.
My first motorcycle was an old square tanker, and I wasn't big enough. I couldn't touch the ground, so I'd have to ride from one curb to the next, you know. Yeah, I've had pretty near all Harleys all my life, except I bought the only new motorcycle I ever bought and still got was a Crocker. I still got it. Got a radio program back east, a biker show. And so they called me about 4 months ago and said, we'd like to have you on the show because we're going to have president of the AMA now, I can't
Youngblood?
Youngblood. And we can't talk to him, would you talk to him? So I said, sure. So he was on one phone, I was on the other, you know. And we talked away, and then I brought up the Hollister thing. And I thought he thought it was pretty good, you know. And then I talked to him about the old Booze Fighter Motorcycle Club that we started when we went to Hollister and all that mess, you know, that never happened, you know. And I said, we couldn't get in the AMA then on account of the name, you know, so we run things outlaw around here. And I said, I would like to see the Booze Fighters in the AMA again because they're all older guys. We've never been in jail, we're not into guns or dope or anything. And he said, I'll take it up with the board of directors. And I said, oh, great. I got a letter just last month from Youngblood, from the AMA, said, had an annual board of directors meeting, and we turned down the Booze Fighters on account of their heavy party. They party too heavy, which is not so, you know. So then this issue of the Motorcyclist magazine come out, with editorial by Youngblood telling about how we're being discriminated against and stuff like that in the cities, you know, and certain parks and streets and stuff. So I wrote a letter back to him just last week. I said, how about discrimination? Here's your own members that you don't have nothing to do with. So I haven't heard from him, so I don't know. But I thought that would help a lot with somebody to get Hollister going, sanctioned by the MA, you know. So maybe something good will come of it, I don't know. It's kind of one-man campaign right now.
You know, there's a lot of people that don't know that the booze fighters were not really, that was a press created
Oh, yes,
phenomenon. What happened at
Life magazine.
Hollister on that day?
Oh, nothing that happens any other meet. Drank a lot, you know, maybe rode a motorcycle in the bar, stuff like that. But the war was over. Life magazine didn't have nothing very exciting. So they imported those people, and like the one picture, they got a fellow sitting on it overhead with the beer bottles around him. Now, one of the magazine, Iron Horse, come out and said, that was me, you know. It wasn't me, you know.
Who was it? Was it an actor?
No, it was an actor. He looked like a fellow belonging to booze fighter by the name of Fat Boy, but it wasn't Fat Boy, because Fat Boy was riding a Crocker at that time. This was a pose same, because nobody gonna sit in the sidewalk and drink that many beers like in that picture and have one too, you know. The cops would run you off. You couldn't do that, you know. You could do a one kind of a thing, you know, like ride in a bar and ride out again. But that Life magazine, but I think Life magazine could take up that, if we do have that 2 years from now, print an edition, I think they'd sell a lot of them and admit what really was. And enough of us 80-year-old guys around, maybe it can tell the story like it really was, you know. So maybe it'll go that way, I hope.
Changed the image of motorcycling forever, didn't it?
It did forever. One of the most important things that ever happened to motorcycle fraternity is that, yeah. That brought on the Hells Angels and everything else. See, that was the right way. Oh, we'll cash in on this. We'll be the bad guys, and that started. A doggone shame.
What do you think about all of this out here?
Oh, I love it. The trouble is, I don't recognize it anymore. Everybody's got old but me. Shoot.
The booze fighters came about.
Well, we had it started out with, you've heard of Wino Willie, good friend of mine. We had the first race after the war in San Diego on a little quarter-mile track, Class C stuff. Willie come down there, and him and another guy got to drinking, and they was out in the parking lot, and that crazy Willie said, let's put on a show. So I forget who was with him. Willie rode right through the crash wall during intermission and made it come around the track and down the straightaway, and Stan Irons, the flagman, run out to flag him down, and man, he see Willie's going right for him. He dropped the flags and run. Willie went in the next corner. I know he's drunk and he'll not make that corner. He made that corner, went down the back straightaway and into the second corner and come down the straightaway again before he finally fell off. And he's trying to start, and I run over and pulled the 2 spark plug wires off because I was running a bike there as in the pits, you know. So he's trying to crank it, and here come the law, and Willie went to jail. Well, he got out in 90 days, so I had a bunch of them working for me at that time. We was unloading freight cars around, and we hung out at a place called All American on Florence Avenue by Florence and Central. So we was there that Friday night when Willie got out, and we said, oh, he belonged to the 13 Rebels. So he went to a club meeting at some few days ahead of time, and they jumped all over him for what he'd done, you know. And so he ripped his sweater off and quit. So we're sitting that Friday night drinking a little. Said, well, we'll start our own club. Well, yeah, well, what do we call it? Well, there was an old guy, he was kind of drunk. He said, let's call it the Booze Fighters. And so we did, you know. But that was a, boy, when they got that name out, well, boy, we was nothing then, you know. We were really looked down on, you know. But we had a lot of good people, like the Roshios and all them. Went to Europe and raced. C.B. Clausen, which first man to ever run 200 miles an hour at Bonneville on a Harley, and a lot of good people belong to it, you know. Even Ed Kretz used to come down there on Friday nights once in a while when we'd have club meeting, have a few beers, you know. But yet, at the racetrack, the Booze Fighters up in the stands, you know, that was the difference. But anyway, that's the history of the Booze Fighters.
John, thanks very much.
I'm Betty Falls, and I'm from Orlando, Florida.
How long have you been a motor?
Well, let's see, next year will be 50 years.
What in the world prompted you to be a motorman?
Well, my mother was one of the charter members of the Motormaids. In fact, she was instrumental in starting the club. And they were Harley dealers. So I naturally rode. In fact, I had a little motorcycle and sidecar when I was 6.
Do you remember your very first motorcycle impression before that early sidecar?
Bouncing around in the nose of the sidecar when I was 6 weeks old.
You've been with motorcycling a long, long time.
Yes.
Did you get involved in officiating at any point?
No, I was the secretary of the Motormaids for a period.
For those people that don't know, tell me what the Motormaids were for, what they did.
I think primarily they tried to improve the image of motorcycling. The fact that you don't have to have a beard and wear leathers to ride a bike.
What were some of the things that you did?
We had a lot of local meets. We met, and it was a social type of club. We just all enjoyed telling stories about our rides.
Did you find yourself at any time at odds with the men for invading their purvey?
Oh, no, no. The men have always been fine to us.
Wasn't it correct that there were a number of different chapters of the Motormaids, or?
Yes, that's the way it's set up. There are districts. Like Florida has their own group. So we meet locally, and then we're welcome to go to any of the other states.
What is there to say about the difference between motorcycling back in the early days and today?
Well, the motorcycles are better. It's an easier ride today.
And how about the people? Are they somewhat different now than they were back then?
I really don't believe so, other than you probably have a lot more professional people riding.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Hi, I'm Millie Harkey, widow of Jules Harkey, competition director of the AMA for a good many years.
Very first impression as a kid that you had about motorcycling?
Yes, it was really my first job because I went to work for the Indian Motorcycle Company. Up at the office of the Indian Motorcycle Company. At that point in time, my husband was working downstairs, and he had the sales department, and he also was in New England. He on the weekends he took care of the sales plus all during the week, and then On the weekend, he was a referee and starter for E.C. Smith when there was only E.C. Smith and his secretary in Columbus, Ohio. And during one of our club runs to Laconia, New Hampshire, they talked us, EC came and talked us into going to Columbus to work on the competition for all over the United States, to develop the program for bigger. It was getting bigger and bigger, and EC felt that he had a great background, Jules, and he kind of said, you know, we knew that Indian was kind of going down the tubes, so we had forewarning of it. And so that was our way of getting to Columbus, Ohio. We had had an accident at one of our races in Pennsylvania, and I said what we needed was a Red Cross flag. And he says, okay, you make it. And we did. But boy, he was real strict on how he wanted it made, very professionally. And we were only kids, we didn't know too much about. But we did, we made a good flag, and that's how the Red Cross flag came into the program of being safety on the track and so forth. And of course my husband was a referee and a starter, so that's when you could be two things. But when he got to Columbus, Ohio, he said, no, it's too much responsibility for one person to be two people, a referee and starter, and he changed that, or had it changed through the competition committee. And most all the rules were made by the competition committee. And we had a terrific competition committee, believe me. If it hadn't been for them, in their years of hard work, we never would be what we are today. They were mostly picked from dealers and people that were and did club work, and the dealers they did club work along with their own work, and they got membership for the AMA, and they worked very, very hard. And I do feel that, in fairness to the AMA, the beginnings of it and so forth, that no one has ever really honored E.C. Smith the way he should have been. He did it out of a suitcase. But E.C. and his secretary, they did a super job all by themselves for years and years. And that should be known, really, I think, because that's the history of the AMA. I enjoyed every bit of it, and so did Jules. That was his life. He started when he was 16, and I started when I was 18, so that was our lifestyle, and we loved it.
Tell me, if you would, when he was born.
He was born April 1st, 1909. Of course, I didn't get to meet him for a good many years. So previous to my meeting him, he had been a member of the AMA, and when he was about 15 or 16 years old, his dad bought him a motorcycle, and it was an Ace, and I believe it was an Ace. I'm not certain on that. But anyway, his dad put the first payment down on it, and then he had to go to work and pay it off, as I understand it. And they bought it from Red Wolverton. Well, Red saw that the kid didn't have any job or anything, so he gave him a job at his shop in Reading, Pennsylvania, and as I understand it. And he didn't know the first thing about, motorcycles or anything like that, except that he wanted to ride a motor or race them or whatever. He probably was one of the oldest of the AMA members, because there didn't have too terribly many back in those days. And but they had started in Philadelphia motorcycle polo, and that's what he loved. When he worked for Red, he belonged to a team, I think it was the Philadelphia Quakers, and they did have teams, 5 or 6 teams throughout the United States, of which they, played against and so forth and so on. But he loved enduros, and he did enduro riding, and he did motorcycle polo, and then he worked at the shop at the same time. He really loved motorcycling. He really was an awfully nice fellow. Most people thought he was just very strict. He was. He really was strict. He really cleaned up the show. Lots of the racers really didn't like him because of that, that he was so strict and ruly and so forth. Oh, he hated anybody that was dirty. I mean, that ruined our show. So he was very strict with the rules. But then the men worked hard on the competition committee to make these rules to better the show, and make it for the public. The public was paying, so they had to look nice. He worked hard at his job, and he loved it. At first, I guess it probably started as sort of as a hobby with him, and then he made it into his life work because he loved it. So, and of course, when they had the competition committee meetings, gradually they start having them in Columbus, Ohio all the time. Only a 3 or 4 day meeting. And they worked hard, those fellows. They did. They gave of the sport, and nobody paid their way in those days. They gave of themselves. And then they worked on the weekends at the races, in different programs they had. Really, they were super people.
My name is Bob McLean, the president of the Antique Motorcycle Club of America for the last 12, 13 years, something like that. I'm proud to be able to say that. There's some very good people before me that did a fine job and set it up so those of us who came later could add to the club. I got started in motorcycles, I think I was 13 years old. My dad brought home an old 1929 Harley 45, which needed to be worked on all week so I could ride it for a little while on the Sundays. In fact, when my brother and I hit the road with it, well, the neighbors all hid because they knew they'd probably need to help push it before we got it home again. The connection with the Antique Club, a couple of the fellows at home set up a chapter, tried to form a chapter there in Davenport of the Antique Club, and I was one of the charter members. We called it the Blackhawk chapter of the Antique Motorcycle Club, and most of the people who formed the club are still around. Some of them are no longer active, of course. My age should do something for that. They were older fellows when I belonged, and I'm now old enough to be going back to the 50th anniversary of the Iwo Jima thing, which when I leave here, we'll fly over there and be on the ceremonies or whatever they're having there on the 14th of this month, which is the surrender date on Iwo. And I'm proud to have been associated with the 4th Marine Division at that time. And I guess my main thought would be kind of nice to see it when it wasn't smoking so much as the last time around. The fare is a little higher this time, but at least I can come back when I want to, not when they let me come back. So that's about the way it goes.
How did you come to be the president of this club?
Okay, when I started here, the original founders were still around. Emmett Moore, Ted Hodgson, Henry Wing Sr., I think, was gone at that time. Henry Jr. was still around, but I don't recall ever meeting Henry Wing Jr. But Ted Hodgson lived here in Florida, and I recall one of the nicest things that happened when we formed the club up there, our local chapter. Ted and Art Siegel, who was the president at that time, I thought what a great thing if they would take time off to come out in the middle of the cornfields there and be with us on our chapter events there. It's developed over the years. We had our first meet. I think we had 4 vendors. They all were in the building there in the Davenport Fairgrounds, and last year we had 507 vendor spaces, so it's grown a little over the years. One of the nice things that happened on our Davenport meet is the races on Friday night. They have the vintage races on Friday night on the half mile there at the fairgrounds, and I think we had 122 competitors there last year, and we get to see lots and lots of the people. We're also fortunate enough to have a fellow in our club, Smitty from Rock Island, who was an old Indian dealer over the years, and he raced and competed with a lot of the fellows who I only knew as names in a magazine at that time. But last year we try to have a good program on our banquet on Saturday night there. Usually we have around 400 people at the banquet. We try to get good speakers and people who are of interest to everybody in the Antique Club movement. We've had Jerry Hatfield and the Jeff Smith, who's head of ARM at this time. And last year we had, because of Smitty, who knew him and raced with him, Dick Mann came up. And if you ever have a chance to listen to Dick Mann, he's a great fella. He can tell stories. If I tried to talk about the things he spoke of at that banquet, they'd throw me out as being a dirty old man, and the ladies almost rolled on the floor laughing with him. He's a great guy. We just have a fine time with him.
Where do you imagine the club is going?
I think that each year we keep picking up members here, and our membership increases. We're now about 6,000 membership in worldwide, range 250 or so are overseas people, and that includes most anywhere in the world you want to go. Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, all the Scandinavian countries. The club has 2 chapters in Canada now. We had the group up in Winnipeg, the Buffalo chapter, and now we're getting a new group out in the British Columbia area. They're just getting that set up now, and we look forward to being out there with them on their road rides and so forth.
How long have you been remaining at the helm?
Well, as long as I feel that I'm able to do a job here. If the people appreciate what I'm doing, and I'll stay as long as they want me. That's all. Otherwise, when I feel that I'm not capable of handling it or not doing a good job, I'll be happy to be one of the past presidents.
Thanks very much.
Thanks for letting me be here.
My name is Susie Pop. I'm the widow of George Pop. We're from Walden, New York. George was a tech inspector for the AMA under Charlie Watson's regime. I was a clerk for the Nationals under Joan and Charlie. And George also was a congressman for the AMA back in probably the 60s. we've always worked for the AMA. We had a dealership in New York State, and we were #1 dealer signing up the most AMAs in New York State for umpteen years. And I joined the Motor Maids when my daughter Suzanne turned 16 and could ride a motorcycle. So then Mother joined in with her too, and she's now 51. So we've been associated with motorcycles for many years. George has worked for the sport of motorcycling. I think he joined in 1937. He joined the AMA down in New York City. He founded the Walden Playboys Motorcycle Club. He donated a piece of land, which is still the Walden Playboys Motorcycle Club Incorporated, where they hold 10 events a year. And one event a year they hold is in his memory. They call it the George W. Pop Memorial. And they fly me from Florida up there to give out the trophies for them. Well, we've just been motorcycle people all our lives, and we've been supporting the sport for all these years, and I've been a widow now 10 years.
If you would recall for me your very first association, your first encounter with a motorcycle, way before you had back in the very, very earliest days when you were just first exposed to it.
Well, I was a young girl just going with George. I was his girlfriend. I joined the AMA, I think it was in 1937. We went to Warrensburg, New York, to a gypsy tour. I can remember riding the motorcycle up there, and we camped out, and it was a big fun thing. You know, it was a real clean fun thing. It isn't like today.
What is there to say about your impression of the difference between motorcycling today and the way it was done back in the 30s and 40s?
Well, I think we had more fun. Today they think they're having fun, but I think we had more fun, and we weren't afraid of nothing. We did everything because we enjoyed it.
Different world.
Altogether different world is right.
Did you at any time have a motorcycle of your own?
Oh, yes, I was a dealer. I was a Yamaha dealer from I was a motorcycle dealer from 49 until 1980, 2 years ago? Till 2 years ago I closed up the store. 79, I was the #1 Yamaha dealer in New York State, and George was living at that time when we both went to Japan for 14 days. So motorcycling has been our lives.
And this back to the beach party, what does this mean to you?
Well, I can remember when George raced down here on the beach back in 1949. 1952, I can remember he rode an NSU. Then he rode a BMW, he rode a BSA. We started with the English and then came up, and we didn't come to Yamaha until the 60s. Okay, 2 years ago, Ed Youngblood, the president of the AMA, called me up and wondered if I could get Joan Watson to come to Columbus. What was to the affair that they were having in July? They asked him why, and he said, well, they wanted to present the Doug Perkins Award to Joan and Charlie, and I said I'd see what I could do. So I said to her, we're going to go to Columbus. Would you like to go? She said, oh, well, maybe. So finally, after a little talking and whatnot, she decided we would go to Columbus. So she drove up to New York. She lived in New Jersey. I lived in New York. She drove up to New York, and she and I drove to Columbus. We were the guests of the AMA. They put us up in the motel, and they wined and dined us. It was wonderful. And then we went to this big banquet, and Ed says to me, do you think she knows anything about it? I said, I know, but she doesn't know a thing. But I said, I bit my tongue all the way out here. And so when they called for her to come up, she's sitting there. She doesn't even know what they're saying. I says, Joan, they're calling for you. And she could have fell through the floor. And she was given this award, Doug Perkins Award, which you probably know is a very prestigious award. And so that was a big thing in her and my life. Was after our husbands, of course, was gone. Too bad it wasn't done while Charlie was still living, but anyway, it was. And they are hanging in the museum in Columbus. And also there's a plaque out there in Columbus in memory of George for money that was donated in his memory. You're welcome.
I'm Joan Watson from Pumpkin Lakes, New Jersey.
How long have you been a motormaid?
I've been a motormaid 46 years.
What in the world prompted you to be a motormaid?
Well, it was a club of all women, at that time all girls, that drove their own cycle. And I thought they looked wonderful. And that's when I started joining. I joined them 46 years ago, and I've been one since.
Did you find yourself in problems feeling as though the men were being competed with by the women?
Not really. We were equal at that time because there were so few of us.
If you would, give me an impression of your very first encounter with a motorcycle, way before you even owned it.
I was about 6 years old. My father drove a bike at that time, so I was kind of born to it.
What was your first motorcycle?
My first motorcycle was an Adler that was brought over piece by piece after World War II. And
your husband was?
my husband was Charlie Watson, an AMA referee for the East Coast and across the country at times. And we both worked for the AMA at all these tracks for many, many, many years.
Is it safe to say then that he performed the same functions that Joe G did?
Yes, in fact, Joe G started him on it at that time.
Now your role was?
I was a clerk for the AMA for many years and also came here to the Speedway year after year and worked with Charlie and anybody under Charlie that had anything to do with it.
So you had an association with the bad guys, the good guy, bad guys?
No, we were all good guys at the Speedway. The bad guys don't go to the Speedway. We went to the Speedway.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
My name is Alan Cathcart.
You were born?
In 1945 in Wales, Cardiff, so I'm Welsh. My very first motorcycle impression was when I was a kid in Wales listening to Graham Walker and Murray Walker, the father and son commentating team, reporting on the Isle of Man TT races. And I remember coming back from school at lunchtime, because in those days I was only going to school a half day, and this would be about the age of 6, and coming back and persuading my mum to turn on the BBC radio so I could hear who was winning the Isle of Man TT. The very first motorcycle I had, first powered two-wheeler, let's call it, was a Berini. Now, not many people know what a Berini is. B for Britain, E-R-I-N-I, and this was I believe a Dutch-made moped with an Italian engine and 2 speeds, slow and slower. And I had this when I was a kid at the age of 15 to get from my house in the middle of the Warwickshire countryside near Stratford-on-Avon to where my friends hung out. And that's how I learned that 2 strokes will oil the plug. The very first competitive event, which wasn't actually a race, was like many people in Britain. I started on the racetrack in the Silverstone high-speed trials, where I took my road bike, which was a 3-cylinder Suzuki 750 Water Buffalo, you call them over here, And I took that to the Silverstone High-Speed Trials in 1973. And I discovered that it wouldn't lean over more than about 20 degrees from upright without grinding away the exhaust. But yeah, that was my first time on a racetrack.
And how did it come to be that, well, tell me about how journalism seemed to work into this.
Classic Bike magazine started in the mid-80s, and I've always been very keen on historic racing cars. Car racing of all kinds, but especially historic ones. And Classic Car magazine has been running for about 7 or 8 years then. One of the sections in Classic Car that I always enjoyed reading most was Willie Green's track tests. And when Classic Bike began, I felt that Classic Bike should have a Willie Green. And I volunteered myself to be the Willie Green of motorcycles. And they accepted. So I started writing racer tests just as a hobby, and the hobby became my livelihood.
I think it's fair to say that you've written more variety of historic motorcycles as well as modern motorcycles than anyone that I can think of. I'm sure you can.
Probably true, but it's not something I take for granted. I realize how fortunate I am.
Yeah.
It sounds very complacent to say it, but I feel that I have reached the level that I've aimed at. I'm in an extremely fortunate position. There is almost no factory motorcycle that I'm not invited to test ride for magazine purposes, or if I ask, they'll let me ride. Many owners of valuable historic bikes allow me to ride their machines for journalistic purposes. And at the same time, I don't know how much longer, I'm successful in competition on modern and classic bikes too. I realize I'm very fortunate, and I just hope that I can find myself in the same position for a few more years yet. I'm the enthusiast whose dream came true, and I started writing about motorcycles long after I was an enthusiast for them. This was never a job. And I'm in the fortunate position that almost every motorcycle enthusiast, particularly of historic motorcycles, would like to be in. So I hope that I can try to convey the impression and the feeling of what it's like to ride these bikes to people like me. And if that means that I don't write as a journalist ought to, and I'm told that I don't, my sentences are too long, I waffle on too long about people and stories, but I tend to think that's what people like me are interested in. And this may not be the snappy kind of designer journalism, I call it, that magazines sometimes expect, but it's the way I write.
No argument for me. Alan, thanks very much. Good luck next week.
Thanks a lot.
My name's Mick Duckworth. I was born in a place called the Isle of Man. I work in England, and I'm visiting California for the first time ever. I've been to the United States before, but not to the West Coast. And I'd like to ask you about your very first motorcycle memory. Well, I guess it goes right back to when I lived on the Isle of Man, and of course the TT racing that takes place there is in and around everything. And when you're a youngster, I mean, my mother and father never kind of took me to see the races. We would stand and be held up by them when we were on a shopping trip. And my very first memory is of coming across a lot of people sitting in trees. And I couldn't understand why there were people in the trees. And then the next moment there was this incredible noise which shocked me so much that I burst into tears. And I was kind of aware of something going by at incredible speed. And I guess that was it. At first I was just plain terrified because everything was so noisy and so sudden for someone who is only knee high. You remember roughly the age? Yes, this would be the early 50s, and the first racing I can remember kind of seeing intelligently really would be in 55, the year that the race officials credited Jeff Duke with the 100-mile-an-hour lap, and then very typically of the British governing body, the ACU, they said, no, sorry, we're wrong, it's only 99.978 or something. But really, my clear sort of memories of TT racing date from 1958, 59, when I was getting old enough to understand what was going on, and was actually actively going along to watch an entire race. And that, of course, was the era of the MVs, when John Surtees and John Hartle were the team riders. And these things really stood out by their incredible sound and also by their speed. And in those days, of course, they didn't seed the riders. They didn't set fast guys off at the front. And I think 58, I believe, John Surtees started at 58th. So he would be starting way over, you know, several minutes behind the first man away, and then was carving through the field of slower riders. But of course they changed that, mainly for safety reasons. Right, well, it was a bit of a fiasco really, my first motorcycle. It was a 125cc Royal Enfield. And it was actually pretty much two bikes, which I bought for the equivalent of in those days, say $3 or whatever. And I was determined to get them going, and I very soon found that I wasn't going to be able to. So I kind of gave up on them, and I switched to a little BSA, the Bantam as it's called, which is very similar to one of the Harley models. It's one of those machines that evolved out of the DKW. And again, I didn't spend an awful lot of time with that, and I very quickly got onto a 1937 500cc overhead valve Sunbeam. And that was my first kind of bike on which I went journeys on the road. And I used to go into my college on it in the mornings, and that was a superb machine. Did you finally come to be competitive? No, I always was on the verge of the sporting side of things, and particularly with the road racing. And I've spent quite a few nights working on those horrendous Suzuki RG500 idle opinions and all this kind of stuff. And I always, because I knew a lot of guys who'd sort of taken the plunge, if you like, I felt that I wanted to keep things in a certain scale in my life. I didn't want it to become all pervading. And particularly as I know that I would have been absolutely drawn into this TT course thing. And I still have very mixed feelings about the whole issue of that circuit. It's an unforgiving place. You only have to have a small technical fault, say a puncture or something like that, and depending on where it happens, you know. So no, I've no claims really at all, except I think I came second in a trial once. Well, I kind of got into the writing thing, and
it's all kind of coincidental in a way, because I'll be absolutely frank that one of the reasons why when I was a freelancer I tended to like to send things to Classic Bike was because they're very professional, they said what they wanted and they paid for what you sent. But at the time I was still running the second of the Triumph Norton Specials that I'd built, so I was still pretty much frozen. And my friends always said, don't you think you ought to get yourself a modern machine, you know, you're wasting your time with this kind of old iron. But in those days, but I was living in London where rents are high and I wasn't earning a great deal of money, the thing about those old British irons was that you could buy a machine for the price of a new moped, and you could go and do 95 miles an hour on it. And that was the appeal, really, that provided you could keep on top of the maintenance. And so I tended to lean towards sort of Classic Bike when I got more and more into the writing side of things. And then a permanent position came up, and the then editor was very, very encouraging. And once I got inside it and I realized what a world it was and how international it was, this really took my interest, because again, I was always fascinated by the American scene anyway, because when I was schoolboy, all we ever saw of it were the occasional pictures of dirt track. Occasionally somewhere you would turn up a copy of Cycle World, and you'd see these kind of unfamiliar things. You'd see dirt track machines, guys wearing these weird crash helmets that came down at the sides, you know, and people painting all sorts of flashy designs on their fuel tanks. It all seemed quite dynamic compared with a very conservative scene in Britain, really, where everyone was running fairly kind of you know, stock racing machines. So this was an opportunity, really, getting involved with Classic Bike to explore the wider world and to pick up on what was going on further afield. And also the realization dawned that just as happens in the UK, there's a whole load of guys out there who are carrying it around in their heads. Some of them are still doing it, some of them are still talking about it. Maybe they're wise enough not to necessarily want to do it, but it just goes on, and it's the fascinating thing about it is that there's always more to find out.
What impressions do you get of the difference between the racing scene back then and the racing scene that you find today?
Well, I guess there's a big difference, because as you say, I was extremely lucky because I can remember vividly the era of, say, starting through Surtees, but the Halewood Honda era, Redman Honda, the works Suzuki's arriving, and it was very, very exciting. And don't forget there was also Jawa involved, Bultaco, Yamaha appeared first off with Americans. Honda had American guys riding with it. There was a lot going on. There was a sudden kind of burgeoning of technical boldness that had been stagnant for a long time. And I think there was a kind of a happy mixture that the guys in those days were they were very, very good, but they had to deal with the fact that the rewards weren't huge. There was a lot of travelling involved, and the risks were very great then, particularly some of the circuits they rode on. And I think there was a fantastic understanding between them all, that they were all part of this. And it does, I mean, looking back, it seems to me to have been a golden age, and there were some very remarkable things that happened then. I think if you look at the first 100-mile-an-hour laps of the TT course by single-cylinder machines in 1960, and consider the tyres that they did it on and the condition of the roads, which are now, I mean, tyres have changed beyond recognition, even on historic racing machines. And the roads over there have been very much smoothed out, and some of the most awkward hazards have been straightened out. So it's a different kind of a deal today, and in some ways it's a little bit tame in that the machines are pretty quiet, modern. Well, I gather that in Grand Prix racing they're now talking about relaxing the regulations on noise because they feel that the spectacle has been so sort of detuned by the restrictions. I guess it's pretty impressive that guys are lapping, say, the Isle of Man at 120, 121. They're still finding the limit of the machines. You know, Honda are taking RC45s to the Isle of Man and finding it out of the crate. They just don't handle. I mean, one Ducati 916 was entered this year, but it never made the race. They had to revert to tried and tested stuff when it came to being competitive. So I admire these guys who are really doing that at the forefront, but at the same time, I think it's a different, it doesn't quite have the same glamour, because a lot of it is based on roadster machines now, TT racing and a lot of national racing. But having said that, there are bound to be people racing today who are as talented as people in days gone by. I mean, it's so difficult to draw any comparisons. Very, well, you're welcome. Thank you.
My name is Jeff Smith. Well, absolutely the first moment that I can remember being mixed up with motorcycles was a day when as a very small child, I rode on the back of my father's 250 Matchless to a trials event somewhere in the Midlands of England. And when we got to the event, the most amazing thing to me had happened. My father's mustache was all frozen up. And so that's my earliest memory is of my dad saying to me, look at this. And here he had a stone mustache for a short time. And so I remember clinging to him, and we rode in very bitterly cold weather down to this event, and obviously he had frozen up at the front. So that's the first memory. Nobody ever asked me that before. Well, my very first motorcycle race was not a race, it was a trial. My father was an avid trials rider in the late 1930s. And of course then the war came along. I'm talking about the 39-45 war. You guys only came and helped us from 42 to 45. And but of course, yours was the winning hand, and we were glad you came along. But obviously, motorcycle sport ceased for a time there, about 5 years, and then my father took up riding in trials again as soon as he could, and so naturally I was interested in trials, and I rode in trials and became quite successful, and eventually BSA gave me a works machine, and for 16 consecutive years I was a BSA works rider. But the beginnings for the first 2 or 3 years I was quite successful in trials, and then of course I became more interested in money, and there was more money in motocross, and so I took up motocross.
How was it that you managed, after your World Championship, to stay away from road racing? I'm surprised. That's a natural progression, it seems.
Yes, it would seem to be a natural progression to go from one fast and dangerous sport to another fast and dangerous sport. When I won the World Championship, I was quite old. In fact, I thought I had maybe slipped past the moment when I could have done it. I won the World Championship in my 30th year, and then I won again in the 31st year. And I think once you get beyond 31, it's too late to think of a career in road racing. And so I stuck for the next few years with motocross. In the declining years, of course, I stuck with motocross and trials and 6 days events. And I have to say that I was never particularly attracted to road racing. I call it the hard stuff, and what I did was the soft stuff. And I much preferred to land it on the soft stuff than the hard stuff. And I suppose that the reason I never went road racing was we could put it down to fear. I'm just absolutely amazed at how fast people are prepared to go on the hard stuff.
How did it come to pass that you headed up ARMA?
It was a sort of an accident. I worked at BSA for 21 years. That's obviously the BSA motorcycle factory in England. And then when they went bankrupt, and I'm not sure if I had any effect on that or not. I mean, I may have been the reason they went bankrupt, but however, they went out of business, and I was offered a job with Bombardier in Canada, Bombardier, who manufacture the Skidoo and the Sea-Doo, and also for a 17-year period manufactured a motorcycle called the Can-Am, Canadian-American. And it was a very successful motorcycle, but it was only an off-road machine. And we always intended to build street machines, but never got round to it. And after 17 years of trying to make a profit with off-road machines, they realized they were never going to do it. And so they decided to close the motorcycle division of Can-Am, and then they put me out to pasture. They didn't need a motorcycle expert anymore, and so I became a pensioner. They gave me a pension and said, go away and graze in this field quietly. And I had not been unemployed for longer than 3 or 4 days when a friend of mine, I mean a so-called friend, called me up and said, why don't you take the executive director position of ARMA? You really only have to work for about 3 weeks a year, because the biggest event is Daytona, and it's really quite small, and they're a dedicated group of motorcyclists, and you would really enjoy it. And he said, and really it's only a part-time job. In fact, you're like the Maytag man. In the summertime, nobody ever calls you up. Well, that's not true. You know, I'm here to tell you that is not true. And the guy's name is Bob Barker, and he definitely led me down the flowered path. But I have to say that some of my most rewarding moments have been in ARMA. I meet absolutely the most wonderful people, and there's no doubt that ARMA is nostalgia-driven, and we all are looking for nostalgia, for a way to recreate the past and to be young again, for a short moment. And those moments occur when you're playing with old motorcycles. I mean, you've been to this place before at this moment, and so you're young again for a moment. And I think that's the attraction of vintage associations all over the US and all over the world. It's nostalgia, and it's being young again, just for a moment. It's like magic. And so I've enjoyed creating that magic and being a part of that magic.
Tell me the germ of the creation of the Battle of the Legends. I understand that's your doing as well.
Yes, I think that the idea was already floating around in ARMA that there ought to be a way to salute the champions of the past. and to do it in a way that would bring attention to them again, and that would make them feel good and make the fans feel good again, and hopefully at no danger to the legends. And so that idea was certainly floating in Armour when I took it over. And so I picked up on an existing idea. I brought it to BMW, who were gracious enough to recognize the potential. The first year that I worked here at Daytona, we had 310 or 15 entries. We had 4,000 spectators in the infield. Last year we had 504 entries and 40,000 people in the infield. And so many people appreciate the opportunity, in my view, not to see old motorcycles. That's a lot of fun, but it's not as much fun as seeing old motorcycle racers on motorcycles out there again. So you can hear names like Nixon and Aldana and Springfield and Springsteen and Riemann and Roder and Mann. Those names announced over the PA system. I've seen people with tears in their eyes hearing those names again and seeing those great people out on the track again.
How long are you going to remain at the helm?
Well, I achieved the great age of 60 in October of last year, and I believe that no one should occupy any particular position for an unreasonably long time. I've been the executive director of Armour for 4 years, and I think if I continue for the next 3, maybe 4 years, so that I'm about 64, then I think I'll be ready to hand over to a younger person, and I hope that what I'll hand over will be a very successful organisation, and I believe it will be. But I want to say something a little bit more than that. The organisation is not one man. The organisation is a whole group of people with the same aim who move in the same direction. And most of the people who make Armour move are still members of Armour. I mean, they come from the original group. And all it required was a spark and some indication of the direction we all should go in to get them all moving in that direction. And so I certainly don't feel that Jeff Smith made Armour. I think Jeff Smith helped Armour to define the direction, and Armour is now moving in a direction that I couldn't stop if I wanted to.
I'd like to ask you one more question, and it doesn't have anything to do necessarily with Armour, but it would have to do with a particular race that perhaps during the time that you were racing for real was the most satisfying day you can ever remember. Maybe you didn't win.
No, I did. The most satisfying day. I for probably 6 years felt that I was close to being worthy enough to be a motocross world champion. And as I mentioned earlier, I thought that I'd slipped past the age when it was possible. But everything came together. The BSI motorcycle I had was a magnificent machine. It was the lightest machine in most of the races that I ran in during the winning years. And I was very well conditioned. I knew that to be 30 and to hope to succeed required me to be as strong as the young guys and smarter. And of course, as the Pennsylvania Dutch say, we're too soon old and too late smart. Well, I was smarter than the young guys, and I wasn't old because I kept training hard. And so I was strong and knew a great deal. And so the most satisfying race, and I'll tell you the exact date, was run on the 13th of September. So 13 is lucky for some. The 13th of September, 1994. It was the last round of the World Championship, and that year there were 13 rounds, so it was 13th, lucky for some. And and that was the race, the last race of the season, where I clinched the World Championship. And that was the most satisfying thing I've ever done in my life. And I was ready to retire and never ride a motorcycle again after that day. But of course I did ride because it's too much fun to not ride.
Do you even have a copy of that?
I don't think so. When you're racing, when you're racing, you don't have time to see all of the press. It's only some years later, and right now I have to say that I collect this kind of thing and read about myself and don't recognize myself. It's like someone else did it.
Yeah, thanks very much.
Okay.
My name is John Surtees. My very first involvement with racing at all was when the first event was held in England directly after the war. And my father, who had raced before the war, had dragged me around with him after he'd got out of the hospital because he had been invalided during the war, and to find another 596 Norton to which he attached a sidecar, and he was busy preparing this, and I as a youngster was helping him, and we went off to Cadwell Park in Lincolnshire, and I saw my, well, it wasn't the first race I would have ever seen, but certainly the first race I ever recall at Cadwell Park, and that was it.
Did you get the impression that you would be participating at that time? Was that something?
Oh, at that stage, not particularly, no. I was more interested in, even at that stage, in just tinkering with spanners. And sort of, most of the time I wasn't let loose with spanners. It would be a piece of rag and polish this or clean that. But he did quite an extensive program of sidecar racing, and I went around with him, and then one day, when in fact I'd just getting on for 14 years of age, we went to an event, and his sidecar passenger didn't turn up. It wasn't a very difficult event. It was a speed trial, which just had a couple little curves in it, and you can guess who was put in the sidecar. Young J.S. put another pair of my father's leathers on, and he was about 16 stone, so they would have fitted me 2 or 3 times. They were bound round, and I was put in a sidecar and said, right, when we get there, you hang out. And that was the start of my competition. We actually won the event, but got disqualified because I was underage.
Tell me, if you would, about your first solo race.
First solo race ever was when I was 15, a grass track race. The weather was absolutely atrocious. It never stopped raining. It was just outside of Luton, and we went there, and I had been given by my father the same bike as he'd started with, which was a B14 500 Excelsior Jap. And I think I managed to fall off it one way or another on every single corner. I did it this way, that way, and everywhere. And that was my first event. I mean, it was thick mud, and I certainly learned a little about how to fall off.
Satisfying race day you've ever had?
In racing, when you're there, as fast as one race is over, you've just purely got your attention on the other, on the next one coming up. One doesn't tend to ponder on the race which is past, because that's history. And you're just there as a competitive person. You're just there to make certain that whatever you learnt in that event, whichever way, with yourself or your machine or anything else, that you put it to good use to make certain that next race you're even sort of better prepared. But I suppose that first race I ever won was a sort of obviously a a very major sort of breakthrough for me. I was working at Vincent HRD as an apprentice. I'd built up a 500 Grey Flash Vincent. I'd gone to the first race with it and the big end went. I went to the second race and I won it. And that was virtually in my coming up to my first full year in road racing. And so from then onwards, the Grey Flash brought me quite a lot of wins. Managed to make a little bit of money, which afforded me to put a deposit down on a Manx Norton. A Manx Norton turned into Works Nortons. Works Nortons turned into Works MV Augustas and NSUs and things like that, and away we went.
When the time came for you to cease motorcycle racing, I think the answer is a good deal different from the reason you quit compared to other people. Why did you end up quitting?
Oh, I love my bike racing, but it was basically because I couldn't continue doing my bike racing as I wanted. That was the reason. Augusta, who I was with, I had a further 2 years of a contract because we'd gone along and said, right, we'll set a 3-year contract, and so I was quite happy. But then they started to introduce changes. They stopped me riding my own machines on British circuits, and I'd prepared some special AJs and Nortons and things like this, because they said it was adverse publicity for their machines. Because the people would say in Italy, oh, you know, John doesn't need an MV to win because he still wins on a Norton or an AJ. Then they came along and said, oh, we'll restrict you to, you know, about 8 races a year. Well, you know, I love my racing, and so when that came about, I'd had an opportunity to test some cars before that. I couldn't ride my own machine, so I said, right, there's nothing in my contract to stop me driving cars. So for that year, which was 1960, I'd race a bike one week in a Grand Prix, and I'd race a car the next week. And so I sort of just went backwards and forwards. And at the end of that year, I retired. But, you know, I still had probably another 10 years left in me in my motorcycling career. But I'd achieved all my main ambitions, and the new objectives I would have liked to have done, like I would have liked to have sort of won a 250 TT in the Isle of Man and gone for that as well. But Augusta had an arrangement with Ubi Ali which didn't allow me to ride the 250s and things like this. So you've got to sort of be driven on by that inner desire, and as that was getting dampened, I just turned my attentions to cars. Well, of course, I basically have 3 careers. I have motorcycling, I have car driving, and then, of course, I have, apart from my business side, I have the car construction, the design and the running of a team, which we did for about 10 years. The 2 areas are fairly different, but at the root core, you know, the top people are not that much different. They're passionately involved with what they're doing. It just so happens that, you know, the car people are interested in 4 wheels and the bike lads are interested in the 2 wheels. There is a lot of difference once you get away from the sort of top competitors. There you find that whereas when I started motor racing, there were people like Graham Hill and Jim Clark and all those who really respected and loved motorcycles, just the same as Ayrton Senna was very keen on motorcycles. I mean, the top Grand Prix driver and motorcycles are not far removed in their interests, but there's lots of talk about sort of different class structures and the rest, but basically the real enthusiasts are enthusiasts, and they're the genuine sort of types. I think it's more today where you tend to have specific groups. And in England, for instance, at this time, or you have like a Mansell brigade who aren't really true car type people. They're a very strange group, but they're not the same sort of people who supported Ayrton Senna and Damon Hill and Berger and those things. So you get these little splinter groups of so-called enthusiasts, and the same applies with motorcycling. You haven't got the mass support for motorcycling that you had in my day. I mean, when in the Isle of Man you'd go along and there'd probably be 80,000 people over there. I mean, a place this packed out, rather similar to Daytona going down. I mean, just nowhere could you move except for motorcycles. You haven't got that sort of thing, but there's still a good core support. And it's what's good about Daytona, of course, is coming along and seeing how international it's becoming. I've just bumped into a lot of my colleagues from Gallerati in Italy. They're all my friends who all live all around the old MV Agusta factory and have large collections of MVs. And what have they done? They've all come over to Daytona. So it's becoming more and more an international event, and that's where this classic events, I think, their strength and the way they need to develop. But what classic motorcycle racing and or car racing requires is a strong governing body. I think that there ought to be specific rules relative to the question of stickers. I frankly cover the transport vehicles, cover the mechanics and people like that, have a big board in the pit showing everybody who supports, but don't plaster the machines. Secondly, I think it's wrong that the total freedom relative to all forms of exotic materials is allowed. Because you go along and you find everybody doing a recreation of machines. At the same time, you can't remove the competitive element. Let people compete. But what saddens me is that you go along and you find some machines superbly prepared, but then you go out and others, you know, machines of my period and machines of manufacturers like MV Agusta, where frankly they are not given the tender loving care and attention to detail that is justified, and so they don't show up as they used to show up. And so I believe that we need to go along and be very strict on the rules. My own thought is that there shouldn't be too many races for the true exotic machines, because frankly all you do is wear them out. But you should have the opportunity to, on at least 4 or 5 occasions a year, to have a proper retro Grand Prix atmosphere where they can be heard, i.e. unsilenced, and where they can be seen, and where they can be driven as hard as the people want to drive them, but not on too many occasions. And that will put pressure on people to make certain that when they do bring them out, they're nicely prepared.
The biggest meetings, for example, Daytona, Bathurst, some of the bigger meetings in England are very heavily participated in. And the smaller meetings, there seems to be a sort of a drop-off.
Well, I think there's too many meetings for classic events, particularly in England. And many of the events should, of course, be purely for total replicas. I think you should differentiate to some extent. And you should have different categories, you know. And in these special events, which I spoke about, the emphasis should be on totally original, authentic machines, at least from a specification point of view. The important thing, everything will have to have parts changed from a point of view of safety and a point of view that the machines deserve it, but they should be authentic. relative to the specification.
John, thanks very much.
Right.
Oh, hi. My name's Florence, M.D.
I'd like you to start with your kids, if you will.
Okay. The oldest one is Bob, M.D., and he rode down here. I don't remember the year, but we were very proud of him. He and Floyd were down here, and Bob got 13th in the main event. And then there's my daughter, Joanne, who worked for the airlines. And thanks to her, we had a lot of passes to take in a lot of the different events, Daytona and Laconia and England. And then there's Don, who won Daytona. And then we have Nancy, who was a powder puff, and she wanted to ride Daytona, and thanks to Paul Smart, he talked her out of it. We really didn't think that was a good profession for her. And she went on to work for the Kawasaki Motor Company and Cycle News, and to this day she still rides. And then we had David, and he never had very good luck at Daytona. He had a few crashes and things, but he was a 250 AMA champion one year. And some motorcycles, and to this day, everybody in our family still loves them and rides them.
Your dad was
Well, my Floyd's dad was one that he had raced motorcycles, and he was a policeman in the Chula Vista Police Department and rode. And I had a brother that rode motorcycles, so we've been around motorcycles all our lives.
How did you meet Floyd?
Actually, at a motorcycle party they had down at San Diego Harley-Davidson in San Diego. That we had met and started going together. We were married in 1941. I had to stop and think. We were married 54 years, and we were in the motorcycle business, and besides racing and helping our kids race and everything. It's been a wonderful life.
If you would, please, I would like to have you take me to the 1948 Daytona from your perspective, from a woman's perspective. What were the things that you did from the time you got up on race day until everybody fell back into bed?
See, it's kind of hard to remember. I remember I was excited that we had, our mechanic had come from San Diego. He was a very well-known ex-motorcycle hill climber, Noel McIntyre, and we had bought a nice, brand new 1948 red Ford pickup truck to make the trip, and Floyd was one of the first ones to put, he had a special-made canvas that was put on the back end of it, so we had a bed in it, so one guy could sleep and one person could drive. We had the motorcycle back there, and it was looked like a beautiful day. We went out to the beach, and the tide was in, and Floyd was lucky. They had a drawing. They had, I think, about 198 riders, and he was lucky. He drew a number on the front row, and he took off in the lead, and nobody ever passed him. He said later he went real fast because he didn't want to, if he fell off, he'd get run over. With all those motorcycles behind him, and I know it was just unbelievable. I kept track of the laps. He wrote each lap down, and his time in the pit stop and all that, and it was a thrill.
And when the race was over, what did you do, all of you?
Well, I like to say we were very excited, a lot of pictures and things, and taking, and then they had a party that night where they give the awards, and it was way at the end of the pier, and we had to walk out there, and when they called him up to give him the trophy, why, they played California, Here I Come. And every time I've ever heard that, it's made me think of it, and then they gave us a check of, I believe it was cash, of $2,000. And in those days, $2,000 was a lot of money. And I remember we had quite a few nice big riders that helped escort us back to our truck since everybody knew how much cash we had. But it was a thrill.
Do you remember who the camera
operator was in the 1948 race for all of that film that
No, no. Today, our friends there from Ohio had given me a picture I'd never even seen before. Dick Clanford and his wife brought it to me.
Yeah. Well, Lawrence, thanks very much.
I'm Barbara Phillips, and I was married to Jimmy Phillips, number 8, who raced starting right after World War II, 1947 or so, until he was killed in an accident at Gardena Stadium in 1958. Now, during that time, he won an amazing amount of races. He won the Del Mar Mile, which was the first time that there'd been a motorcycle race on that horse track. And on his Screaming Triumph, a beautiful win. And then he won a lot of races at Carroll Speedway, Gardena, Ascot, and particularly on the TT tracks. Jimmy was really a great TT rider, and he won a number of races at Box Springs and the Figure 8 at Lincoln Park and the Figure 8 out at Riverside Half Mile. And then he won the Peoria 45-inch and the 80-inch TT national titles and became national champion for, I believe it was 1951. He traveled the country as many of the racers did in those days, and I went with him on some of them, and we had a great old time, except that in the Middle West, when we'd pull in with the Triumph, not many people would talk to us. The Indian riders would talk to us. Bobby Hill and Bill Tooman would always talk with us. We were great. But the Harley riders just looked at us as though we were, you know, something that they couldn't stand, because they figured item 1, this Triumph isn't going to win anything, and then when he beat them, then they were even madder. So it was kind of an interesting thing. Things have changed a great deal in the world since the early 1950s. But we traveled around, and if, for instance, we went up to Des Moines, Iowa for a mile national, and we got up there about Tuesday, and it started to rain, so nobody could practice. And the rain kept on day after day, and our motel room kept getting fuller and fuller of racers from all over the country. We sat around and talked and drank a lot of beer, and finally, on Sunday, when it was still raining, everybody packed up and went on to the next race. But those, you know, you were out there trying to make some money, and here you were, sitting around doing nothing. But it was a lot of fun in those days. The tracks were not nearly as well conditioned as they are now. Jimmy loved Daytona Beach. He did not do spectacularly well there. He kept having motorcycles that didn't last, but he was second one year, third another year, I think fifth or sixth another year. So he was always up in there, but when the motorcycle kept running. And he raced both Triumph and Harleys there. He raced Laconia and did not do very well there. His bikes never held up at Laconia. But he did well at Langhorne and some of the other big tracks back east. And when we raced around California, we'd go up to Tulare and up to Hollister and up to Sacramento and over to Bay Meadows. Everybody was always excited when there was a race at Bay Meadows, because that meant all the gals could dress up, and you know, we'd all get to go out to dinner Saturday night, some nice place. It was a lot of fun. So we enjoyed going up there. But that was, I'll tell you, that was Bobby Hill and Bill Tooman were so good on that track. It was just unbelievable. That's when the Indians were really running beautifully. And I got a big kick out of watching them beat Harley factory riders on their home worked on Indians.
You know,
But
this is one of those opportunities. Most of the guys that sit in that chair are men, and I've been missing the female perspective. On a typical race day, out on the road, you would take me from the time your head leaves the pillow in the morning, not what he did, but what you did, until the race was over and you went out to dinner or to wherever you went.
an out-of-town race. All right, what have we got? All right, Santa Barbara TT. That was always a fun one. Because we'd get up in the morning and load the bike, and the two of us would drive up 101 to Santa Barbara, usually stop and visit a couple of friends that I had in town there, and go out to, I believe it was called Foxen Canyon. It's a beautiful residential area right now, very expensive homes, but it was just a pretty little canyon right there in town in Santa Barbara at that time. So after we usually had lunch before we went over to the track, and Jimmy would get all set up. It was very primitive. I mean, we threw a tarp out in the ground to put all our things on, and we would get set for all the practice. Jimmy'd get his bike out, and usually he didn't even bother to bring a mechanic or a helper with him. He'd just get his bike out. Usually we pitted right next to Ed Kretz. So, and he came up the same way. It was just him without a helper. So the two of them kind of worked together, and the track was kind of a nifty little thing that went up and down the hill. And they would go out and practice, and everybody'd stand around and talk, and then they'd have their races, which were always very good, and which Jimmy won most of. But we would, you know, I'd go wander over with some of the other wives and have a beer, or I'd talk to him as he came in from a heat race, and it was a fun thing. It was like going on a picnic, except that he went out and rode every once in a while. And that was the fun time. There was no pressure on anybody. I mean, this was not some big thing that you had to win. It was nice if you won it. And we carted home trophies. But we went, when the race was over, we'd go over probably and visit a friend of mine, or we'd gather up a bunch of the other riders and go to Mom's Italian Kitchen, and about 20 of us would sit around and have a big spaghetti dinner, and then we would drive. In those days, we could get back to South Pasadena from Santa Barbara in about 2.5 hours. It was, you know, just a breeze down the road. Now, it was very different if it was a serious race. If we were going to Bay Meadows, then we went up a couple of days ahead of time and got a nice motel, and Jimmy vanished because all the riders and their tuners all got together there in the pits, and women couldn't go in the pits in those days. So all the gals would get together up there, and we had a great old time gossiping about everybody and seeing what lady was with what rider this time, and who had left who, and who'd had a baby, and so forth and so on. But we then at night, a bunch of us would all go out to dinner together, and it was great because we'd go out with the Northern California riders, and some of them that we didn't see very often. Joe Leonard and Paul Albrecht, for instance, who were just both great riders. I have a picture of a trophy dash at Gardena Stadium, and it's number 54 Albert Gunter, who after an accident was paralyzed, and when they finally let him go home, he committed suicide. He could not stand the thought of living like that. The next person in line was Chuck Basney, who was killed at Gardena in 1957. Next person in line is Jimmy Phillips, who was killed in 1958 at Gardena, in approximately the same location as Chuck was. And next to him was number 84, George Everett, who was killed the following year, 1959, at Gardena. Death was with us all the time. It always seemed as though when you went to the races, you didn't know if the man you were with was going to come home again or not. And I have a happy memory of the fact that when Jimmy got out of the truck to go in the pit gate, we kissed for a nice long kiss before he went in there, because that was it. But when somebody went down in front of him, he flung his bike to try and miss the man in front of him. It went up the wall and came down, and the cases hit his head. The minute that that dust cloud was happening, I knew it was Jimmy, and I knew it was bad. And I was up and out of the stands, and Don Holly's wife, Stella Holly, ran right behind me. We went down and got somebody to follow the ambulance up to the hospital, and then everybody came up there. And so it was something. We had a funeral at the Veterans Cemetery in Sawtell, because Jimmy had been in the Navy, and they said it was the biggest funeral they had ever had at that cemetery. That cemetery dates from the middle 1800s. So it was something that all of us have lived with. We have husbands that come home in a cast, husbands that come home scuffed and scarred up, but you can't ask them to quit. Not if you're going to continue living with that man. Because for Jimmy, who was, quote, a hero, he won enough races and enough people thought he was wonderful to where if I said, don't race anymore, there was nothing to replace that. And you couldn't, it would be like cutting his feet off or something. So at one point in any racing wife's life, she has to decide whether she's going to put up with this anxiety or she's going to leave, because it's that simple. That's what you have to do. And fortunately, most of the wives stuck around and supported their husbands, and most of their husbands survived, which was wonderful. But those who didn't, you know, were just out of luck. I was fortunate in that I had a lot of friends in the motorcycling world because I'd been in it when I met Jimmy. And so I've always kind of stayed in contact with all my friends in that world. Now, it was a close-knit world. We could be far, far from home and walk into a motorcycle shop and say, hey, we have a problem. We need a space to work on a motorcycle before the race. And the dealer 99% of the time would say, oh, sure, come on in, let me help you, come on for lunch, come to my house for dinner. everybody was friendly outside of the rivalry between the various brands, but by and large, you knew perfectly well that you were going to be with somebody who wasn't going to knock you off your motorcycle. But it was a world where when Jimmy was killed, I immediately heard from people in the Middle West, people on the East Coast, all over the country. I got a tremendous reaction, and I've still got a stack of letters tucked away somewhere. But the racers then came a long distance, usually, to one of these races. They had sacrificed something to do it, maybe a regular job or something. The factory did not pay them. Occasionally, if you were good enough, you got free parts. And if you were real good, then you got $100 if you won the race, something of the sort. It used to be the motorcycle racers were like some of the old Hollywood screen stars. And they were looked up to and admired. And when you would go down to the pits after the race, I generally had to peel women off of Jimmy because they would cluster around him. He was very attractive to women. And so I had to kind of watch him to make sure that they didn't all grab him at once. You're welcome.